18th century is not generally associated with generational change. In his influential essay on the problem of generations, Karl Mannheim, writing in the early 19th century, concluded that it was not until, writing in the early Europe witnessed its first self-aware social generations, and that this was only possible, this phenomenon was only possible, he argued, because of an acceleration in the pace of progress. Accordingly, E.P. Thompson thought that the 18th century England had not yet reached a point at which it was assumed that the horizons of each successive generation would be different. And yet more recently, historians writing about the 18th century often imply generational change. One or two have even pointed in narrow circumstances to the idea of generational change, even if this hasn't been explicitly investigated. And contemporaries were certainly aware of their place within distinct generations. One of the most explicit examples I've found of this comes from an anonymous author of an address to English Protestants, which was published in Newcastle upon Tyne in 1780. This pamphlet stressed the importance of the older generation as monitors and remembrancers, so necessary to every class and age of man, it was suggested. It also bemoaned the looseness of principle that was the stain of this enlightened generation, a cohort who, by their example, were poisoning the minds of the rising generation. And so here we have a really clear articulation of three different social generations in the 1780s. And we also have an unambiguous reminder of the tension between tradition and innovation that were lived out in the relationships between the generations. The research that I'm going to be talking about today was drawn from my book, Age Relations and Cultural Change in 18th Century England. And as you'll see, this research began as an exploration of the political tensions in Newcastle during the 1770s. But the project quickly mushroomed into a much more complex investigation of generational change. It's still centred on Newcastle, but it's not a local history. Instead, it provides a northeastern perspective on English society. And this is a useful vantage point, given that the cultural trends in 18th century England are usually assumed to have emanated from the capital into the regions, with London acting as a conduit for continental fashions that were often overtly Francophile. Whereas several historians, notably Roy Sweet and John Brewer, have pointed to the emergence of more domestic and a more pluralistic outlook emanating from the provinces during the second half of the century. And looking at this period through the lens of age relations provides a clear chronology of the changes that were taking place. And this allows for a more, that allows these more self-confident and less derivative expressions of cultural identity. So today I want to start by explaining why it is that I think age relations is such a useful social category for historians, and to identify how age can be used as an analytical framework. And then I'm going to turn to using the generational change taking place in the 18th century to make my case, beginning with the age-based divisions in the political arena, before tracing these back to the nurseries and schoolrooms where formative years were spent, and then following a generation of children into early adulthood. And while this is the history of 18th century England, the ideas that I'm going to be discussing have a much wider implications, and I would argue that they're actually relevant in any context, although that might be a very big claim. So firstly, why do I think that age is such a useful category for historians? Age is, of course, both a social construct and a chronological inevitability. In other words, what it means to be a particular age is dependent on cultural context, whereas progression through the life cycle is a universal experience. What's more, it's an experience that transcends, or I don't know, maybe it's better to say it intersects with other social categories such as gender and class. And it does so in a unique way. And this is because age is a process. And so to study the past through the lens of age relations, therefore introduces a temporality that obliges us to recognise that people lived through and not in the past. And it's this intrinsic temporality that sets age apart from other social categories and makes age relations, I would argue, a particularly robust tool of historical inquiry. As Reinhard Koselleck argued, if history is to be distinguished from the social sciences, it requires a theory that makes it possible to accommodate the changes in temporal experience. It therefore seems somewhat surprising that age relations are not a conventional category of historical analysis. And this isn't to say that age has been overlooked by historians, but stages of the life cycle tend to be considered in isolation. And so attention is concentrated on, say, the history of childhood or of youth or of old age. In an early modern context, the life cycle is often used to explore concepts such as masculinity or the family or poverty, for instance. But even then, changes over the life course are extracted from lived experience in a manner that renders the life stages static, both in terms of personal biography and in terms of social time. And so even when intergenerational relationships are investigated, such as parent-child or grandparent-grandchild relations, progressed from childhood to old age, let alone that they did so as part of a generational cohort. And yet I would argue that customs are most open to being transformed as they are passed from one generation to the next. And as a consequence, the relationship between generations are central to cultural change. The idea that the younger generation breached the boundaries of adult society is, I think, wonderfully visualised in the satirical print from 1774. And this is the image from the front cover of my book. And here a father struggles to recognise his son, who's flamboyantly dressed in the latest fashions. And this is an image that I'm going to return to in due course. But here it provides a very vivid example of the intergenerational tensions between tradition and innovation. Now, if we stop to think about it, this generational process is something that we intuitively recognise in our own lives. For instance, we're all aware that the life course marks the passing of time as a series of personal transitional events, in which the expectations of youth gradually give way to the experience of age. At the same time, I think we all recognise, even if only indistinctly, that age relations reverse this process. It's the experience of the older members of society that must eventually give way to the expectations of the rising generation. And it's this process of intergenerational transition and the link between youth and innovation that I want to place under the spotlight. And more specifically, I want to demonstrate how age can be used as an analytical framework, how identifying the generational contours of a society allows you to follow age cohorts through the life course. And this provides a tangible structure, often lacking in cultural histories, whilst imposing a chronological precision that is often lost as thematic analysis skips across years, decades, and at times even centuries. And it's this that makes it possible to discern the incremental and contingent patterns of change. Age relations are therefore particularly pertinent to an investigation of 18th century society. This period of English history witnessed a notable demographic and economic transition that has often been cast as a liminal phase, dividing the early modern from the modern period. But as structural explanations of social history have lost ground to nuanced explorations of the construction of cultures, the mechanisms of change have become more difficult to elucidate. We find ourselves in a position where early modernists have remorselessly found precedent for anything claimed as an 18th century innovation to have appeared ever further back in time. Or conversely, the emergence of the modern era is postponed until the dawning of the 19th century. Either way, the idea of the long 18th century pervades the historiography, despite the momentous changes that were taking place. So putting age relations centre stage provides a methodological approach with which to negotiate this transition without seeking to identify or pinpoint the birth of the modern world. Instead, attention is focused upon the transient ripples of an ongoing generational process. And so at this juncture, I want to provide some specific examples of age relations in order to give you some concrete examples of what it is that I'm talking about. And I'm going to start by explaining how I became interested in age relations and why it's important to pay attention to age when we investigate the past. And so my interest in age began with the following notice, and I'm sorry if this isn't very good quality. This notice was placed in the Newcastle Chronicle in November 1775. It reads, "The correspondent desires we would insert the following view of the respective ages of all of the crowned heads of Europe." And it then proceeded to list the ages of the crowned heads and some of their heirs. When I first came across this odd little paragraph, I was researching the political tensions of the 1770s, and it pricked my curiosity. I was left wondering, why was this information of interest to the reader? Why did the ages of the European rulers and their heirs matter? And what exactly did their ages convey to an 18th century audience? Evidently, to some contemporary eyes, these facts were far from inconsequential. In 1774, a self-styled old member of parliament had asked, "Is there any man in his senses who can seriously imagine that we shall remain in peace for 5 years, with 3 young monarchs on the principal thrones of Europe, and 2 old ones looking with hatred and revenge against us?" So was the old member of parliament right to place such an emphasis on age? Would his distinctions between youthful ambition and resentful old age be a common perspective? Would the age of the reader change their perception of this information? Or to put it another way, would someone in their 20s see this information in the same light as an old member of parliament? The more I thought about these questions, and the more reading around the subject of age that I did, the more I realised that as historians, we don't tend to pay sufficient attention to the age of the historical actors we engage with. Within our own lives, age is a conspicuous that's spent trying to defy the physical consequences of the aging process. Age is one of the ways in which we categorise ourselves and others. Even if only subconsciously, we recognise that an individual's biography has a chronology, a duration. People of different ages have lived through different experiences, have witnessed different events, or the same events at different stages in their life course. And as a consequence, we wouldn't conflate the views of someone in their 80s with a youth of 18. But this is exactly what we so often do when we look to the past. We quote from people's published work or private papers without reference to their age, and generally without recognising the importance of the accumulated experiences they've lived through. And this is very often to obscure an aspect of meaning that would have been intuitive to a contemporary. So, for instance, the following's taken from a parliamentary speech from the Honourable Charles James Fox, who'd been an MP for 38 years when he died in 1806. And for my purposes, the context of this is unimportant. But Fox stood in front of the House and he said, "What, sir, is the conclusion to be drawn? Why this? Let us satisfy ourselves. Let us act according to the dictates of honour and conscience and be at peace with our own minds. It is thus that we shall sooner or later regain the confidence of our constituents, if indeed we've lost it, and not by humouring, as a foolish nurse humours great lubberly boys, the wayward whims of a misled multitude. The characteristics of this House should be firm and manly steadiness, and unshaken perseverance in the pursuit of great and noble plans of general utility, and not a wavering, inconsistent fluctuation of counsels regulated by the shifting of a popular breeze." So if we take this at face value, this appears to be the advice of an elder statesman, the wise words that convey a confidence of many years' experience. But this speech was made in 1770, when Fox had been an MP for just, in fact, slightly less than 2 years. And what's even more striking is that he was just 21 years old. This puts an entirely different inflection on his words, especially when we consider that his political detractors were prone to dismissing the young cub, a foppish boy, who was said in the Newcastle Chronicle in 1774 to have studied little but dress, and yet by his connections, not his abilities, has wriggled himself into high places and hath the vanity and the presumption to think himself able to steer the state. In the light of such comment, presenting his words of wisdom in the House could be taken as an infuriating, overconfident youth, and why he might as easily irritate as impress his elders. And so, as this example of Fox demonstrates, age matters and needs to be taken into account when interpreting evidence. And armed with this revelation, which in many respects is self-evident, my investigation of the political tensions of the 1770s took a new turn. And it's the generational division that I discovered in the political arena that I want to turn to next, as it's here where I first encountered the generational contours of the 18th century. Now, at the national level, it quickly became obvious to me that the young cub, Charles Fox, was not the only youthful MP to enter the House in 1768. A total of 40 men under the age of 25 had gained parliamentary seats that year. And just 6 years later, in 1774, a second wave of 46 youthful MPs further swelled the ranks of this new generation of politicians. And this conspicuous increase in the number of young men in Parliament was mirrored by a decline in venerable old members. In the 1774 election in Newcastle has long attracted attention because it was the first electoral contest in the town for a generation. But the importance of age has previously been overlooked by the historians who've studied this political event. The two sitting MPs in Newcastle in 1774 were Sir Walter Blackett and Matthew Ridley, who were 67 and 63 years old, respectively. And they'd been the town's MPs since 1747, when an informal truce between the Tories that supported Blackett and the Whigs that favoured Ridley resulted in a situation where there were no contests until 1774. So these two were part of what had become an entrenched oligarchy, and they faced an increasing amount of criticism during the early 1770s, and their age was evidently part of the problem. Consequently, even when Matthew Ridley decided not to stand in 1774 due to ill health and was replaced as the Whig candidate by his son, who was just 29 years old, the anti-establishment propaganda produced in Newcastle still capitalised on the old age of the ruling elite in the town. It was in this context called Constantine Phipps and Thomas Delaval, who was 42, declared their intention to stand, and the first contested election for a generation ensued. So just as old age had become associated with the status quo, youth was being linked to the political reformers, whether this was presented as a positive attribute or a political liability. So much so that when the Newcastle Freeman's magazine carried a letter expressing disapproval of the political faction that divided the town, it was not ideological or party divisions that were focused on, but disunity across the age groups. And readers were reminded that the old may inform the young, and the young animate the old, and even those who are most retired from the scene of business may be useful in this cause to those who are in it. The reformers would actually go on to lose the election, but I don't intend to go into the details of the campaign here. Instead, I want to look at the evidence of age-based voting behaviour. Newcastle offers a particularly useful case study in this context. The town had an unusually large electorate, and this was because all of the members of the town's guilds could vote in a general election. And this meant that I could use the guild membership and apprenticeship records to identify the approximate age of those who voted in the public ballot. And this procedure wasn't without its problems. Most notably, people have got a terrible habit of naming their sons after themselves. And it certainly wasn't possible to identify all of those who cast their vote in 1774. But it was possible to discern age-based voting patterns. And while this was more prominent in some guilds than others, it was clear that voters in their 20s and 30s were more likely to be voting for reform. So, for instance, the house carpenters voted, their vote was evenly split between the reformers and the establishment candidates. And yet those admitted to the company after 1759 gave the reformers almost twice as many votes as they cast for Blackett and Wrigley. This was evidently testing family loyalties as well. So, for instance, the shipwright Robert Wallace voted for Blackett and Wrigley, as did his eldest son, who was in his mid-40s. But his three younger offspring all backed the reform candidates. Again, the joiner John Eden voted for the establishment candidates, whereas his two sons both voted for the reform candidates. It's clear that the ageing oligarchy in Newcastle had played a part in politicising age, but this link between youth and reform was not limited to the Newcastle election. As Nicola Jones has noted, the majority of those involved 30s, and much of their wider support was drawn from an even younger cohort. Clearly then, I had in fact identified an age-based divide in the political arena, and this raised questions about how this generational rift had emerged and what, if any, impact was it having outside of electoral politics. So it was at this point that I began to think about how I might use age relations to trace change over time. Or more specifically, I came to the realization that if I was going to understand what was going on in the 1770s, I needed to know what had happened during the lifetime of the younger voters and how their experiences might have shaped their political outlook. And so what I want to do now is to provide a brief summary of some of my findings so as to piece together an example of how the generational contours of society expose the multifarious nature of historical change. And I want to begin with childhood. The age cohort who were most likely to be on the side of the reformers in 1774 were born between the late 1730s and the early 1750s. And so it was here where I started my research for an understanding of the generational divisions that I'd stumbled upon. And it wasn't hard to find changing practices that would have impacted upon the childhood of this generation. So, for instance, it was during the 1740s that a new style of children's literature appeared in print. And this is one of the earliest examples, a pretty little pocket book published by the 29-year-old John Newbery in 1742. These beguiling little books promoted a popularised version of John Locke's educational theory, in which parents were encouraged to embark upon their children's rational education in infancy. And as part of this, learning was made to appear as if a game. Another of these books, just to give you another example, another book published in 1742 was Thomas and Mary Cooper's The Child's New Plaything, which was advertised in the Newcastle Courant in March of that year as the best amusement, intended to make learning to read a diversion instead of a task. The Coopers had included an alphabet to be cut out for children to play with based upon Mr. Locke's plan, and the preface advised parents that they should embark upon their infant's education as soon as the child begins to form articulate sounds. Now, these ideas weren't new. It was in fact half a century since Locke had written his thoughts on education, in which he'd lamented the lack of suitable reading material for young children. What was different was that Locke's ideas were being modified for general consumption, and they were have to actually engage with Locke's educational theories. They could simply buy a relatively inexpensive little book designed to entice children into learning. It was also during the 1740s and into the 1750s that traditional schooling faced an increasing competition from a growing number of commercial schools. Most formal schooling before 1740 in England had been a charitable endeavour, providing free or more likely subsidised education in either religious schools or endowed grammar schools. And in both of these cases, it was common practice to focus on training the memory, so learning by rote. But the new commercial schools placed an emphasis on applied learning. And similar to the preschool books that we've just been looking at, these new schools promoted the idea that children should actively engage in the learning process. This change in educational practice is most clearly seen in the teaching of grammar, and more specifically in the mid-century population of vernacular grammars. Grammar in England had traditionally been taught only to boys and in Latin, and grammar books that were written in English were designed as a precursor to this Latin education. And so they introduced aspects of language structure that simply don't exist in English. Vernacular grammars did away with these Latinate irrelevancies. And Newcastle was home to one of the most influential of the vernacular grammarians, Anne Fisher. And Anne published her new grammar in 1745 at the age of just 26. And clearly she wouldn't have had a formal grammar education herself because she was a girl. Fisher also opened a girls' school in Newcastle in 1745. And so she was breaching gender boundaries both by writing a grammar and by teaching it to girls. For Fisher, grammar was not a precursor to learning Latin, but a subject in its own right. And teaching English as it was spoken didn't necessitate memorizing without comprehension. As she argued, it's not the unmeaning repetition of rules, but the application of practice that makes them familiar. It was claimed that her methods made grammar easier and quicker to learn, and it was certainly much more accessible than the traditional grammar school education. And it actually had a huge influence on that grammar school education, which was adapted over the coming decades. So in combination, the new style children's literature and these books, these new grammar books, resulted in a more literate generation. And at the same time, the idea that children should passively receive instruction was losing ground in the learning process. And it was, of course, young men from this age cohort who were asserting their opinions in the political sphere in 1774. But the link between the nursery and the political arena was a complex one. And following this cohort into adolescence reveals a range of factors that complicate any attempt to plot a clear path between childhood experiences and adult behaviour. And so it's these adolescents that I want to turn to next. The experiences of youth were transformed during the second half of the 18th century. But the historiography of youth has tended to focus on either the early modern apprentice or the 19th century juvenile delinquent. And the transitional phase between the two has simply been taken for granted. And so following the children of the 1740s into adolescence and through to their early 20s provided an opportunity to bridge this divide. For those that you don't know, throughout the early modern period, apprenticeship had provided training for the majority of male youths and a considerable number of females, and this was true across most of Europe. In practical terms, this meant that the years between childhood and adult status were spent living with a master or a mistress as an indentured employee for up to 10 years. Sometimes this involved paying quite a considerable amount of money for an apprenticeship to an artisan trade or to one of the professions. But apprenticeships might also be in husbandry or domestic service, where youths were in effect farmhands and servants. In all of these cases, this was life cycle employment. It was training to take on adult roles. And the lives of these youths were quite heavily regulated by their masters and mistresses, who took on quasi-parental responsibilities. And these apprentices signed indentures, so work agreements, forbidding drinking, gambling, fornication and marriage, and even imposing dress regulations. The guild records in Newcastle demonstrate that by 1770, this traditional apprenticeship had all but disappeared. And although these records only actually provide us evidence of male experiences, as females were debarred from guild membership in Newcastle, they nevertheless make it possible to chart the timing and the nature of this transition. Apprentices had traditionally been taken on one at a time, moving in with their employer to learn their trade, as we can see in this idealized image of a shoemaker and his apprentice. And on completing an apprenticeship in one of Newcastle's guilds, bestowed the right to elections. But all of this began to change in the early 1750s. A growing number of wealthy masters were deciding not to apprentice their sons, and instead this cohort were increasingly likely to join the guild by patrimony. In other words, they inherited their place in the company rather than having to work for it. And this was not simply a case of upward social mobility. Wealth certainly hadn't prevented previous generations from undertaking an apprenticeship. There was something quite different going on. And this shift in practice can be linked to increases in educational provision that we've just been thinking about. But apprenticeship was not simply declining in a direct correlation with the growth of commercial schooling. Instead, masters were increasingly likely to be apprenticing several juvenile workers simultaneously. And it was becoming common practice to employ these youths on terms that would not bestow the right to company membership or any of the privileges that entailed. And so apprenticeship was becoming a case of employing low status workers rather than training the next generation of master craftsmen. And as a consequence, the traditional living apprenticeship was in decline. Now, there are several factors that influence this transition, and probably more than I've thought of. But firstly, there's the nascent class distinction emerging between masters and apprentices that meant that middle-ranking families were becoming reluctant to have an apprentice move in with them. And this was especially true given that masters' sons were increasingly likely to be living at home while attending school. Moreover, the more youths a master was employing, the more impractical living apprenticeship became. But in addition to these cultural issues, there was also a demographic dimension to the changes that were taking place. The age structures in 18th century Newcastle appear relatively stable when specific age groups are expressed as a proportion of the total population, as this graph from based on the Cambridge Group's figures demonstrates. However, there were a series of mortality crises between 1716 and 1733 that took a toll particularly on the very young and the very old. And this led to the highest level of sustained infant mortality during the entire early modern period. And the later years, so the very early 1730s, there's also a steep drop in the birth rate. And although demographers haven't been able to figure out why, it's probably connected to whatever infections people were getting. But whatever the reason, the steep drop in the birth rate compounded the impact of high. Followed by a return to normal birth and death rates after 1733. This caused a short-term blip in the age structure of society. And this can be seen as a numerical dip that rippled through the following decades. Even if, rather frustratingly, the uneven age groups and the 5-year rolling averages used by the Cambridge Group dissipate this effect to some extent. The largest change in the age structure was between the 25 to 44 age group, which is the top line on the graph here, which peaked at almost 30% of the population in the early 1730s and then fell to just 25% during the mid-1750s. However, if this age group is directly compared to the 15 to 24 cohort, so the apprentice cohort, the compounded effect of these fluctuations becomes more apparent, as the number of youths per 1,000 adults between 25 and 44 jumps from somewhere around 575 to 725. Now, this might have been very short-lived and statistically insignificant in relation to long-term demographic trends, but it must have placed a strain on traditional juvenile employment structures during the 1750s and so hastened their demise. It must also have played a role in the growing number of commercial schools at this time, but again, it was only one of several factors that was promoting change. And in addition to the cultural and demographic factors that I've mentioned so far, there were also unrelated geopolitical and economic processes driving these developments. And the example of the Newcastle Shipwrights gives us insight into some of these. So throughout the 1750s, the shipwrights in Newcastle had struggled to compete with the growing number of unregulated shipbuilders elsewhere on the Tyne and just down the coast on the River Wear. And the image here is actually from John Rain's map of Sunderland, showing the shipbuilding taking place on the north bank of the River Wear. Now, those entitled to take up membership of the shipwrights were instead, it was complained, trading outside of the company structures. And this was both the sons of freemen and apprentices who completed their term. Moreover, the unregulated shipwrights were evidently employing greater numbers of apprentices than the company would allow. And as a consequence, company men were breaking the rules in order to compete and were being fined if they were caught. In an attempt to solve this problem, the company rules were amended in 1751 to allow 2 youths to be trained in tandem. Then, in company men were again breaking the rules, and initially higher fines were introduced in an attempt to prevent this. But 6 months later, a petition requesting the right to employ what were in effect unofficial apprentices on short-term temporary contracts was granted on the ground that an escalation of military activity necessitated the rapid expansion in capacity in order to prevent work from being taken to other ports. Now, employing groups of youths in this way was significantly altering the dynamics of the master-apprentice relationship. And the notebook of the local JP, Edmund Chew, demonstrates that strength in numbers was allowing some apprentices to act quite boldly. So, for instance, in 1760, Chew granted a general warrant against Andrew Headley and 5 other apprentices who were apprenticed to the shipbuilder William Todd for refusing to work except on tide hours. So as this suggests, the patriarchal heads of households were losing the regulated authority that the traditional apprenticeship structures had given them, and they were increasingly dependent on the criminal justice system to shore up their position as employers. Overall then, the youths of the 1750s and 60s were gaining more freedoms. Whether they were apprenticed or attending school, they were no longer subject to the same levels of social regulation that the traditional apprenticeship system had imposed. Youths were not living under their master's roof, and instead they were taking lodgings or living with their parents, who didn't have the same legal authority over them that their masters had enjoyed. And this was undermining adult authority whilst adding to the youthful hubris of this generation. And it was in this context that age-old complaints about the behaviour of youth became more audible. And I've included one of my favourite quotes on the topic because Job Orton's words have such a familiar resonance. Orton, a dissenting minister, was 54 years old in 1771 when he complained, "There are too many instances of young persons who are unnaturally indolent. They love sleep and inactivity, and if they do go from home, they saunter along as if their limbs would not carry them." At first glance, this seems an almost timeless comment on adolescence. But it's important to recognise that earlier in the century, such youths would likely to have been living with the master, working for their keep, and being regulated by the terms of their indenture. And again, if we return to the image, well a day, is that my son Tom? This satirical print from the countryside being shocked by the urban styles of his son, who's dressed in ridiculously exaggerated macaroni fashion. But to see this image as contemporaries would, it's essential to recognise that in previous generations, the dress of adolescents and even young men into their early 20s was regulated through the apprentice system. And this had included relatively, in fact, sometimes very wealthy young men apprenticed to the more prestigious trades and professions. The young adults then of the 1770s had grown up during a period when education, training and family life were being transformed, a period when active learning took precedent over received wisdom, and when they gained more social freedoms as youths. And this clearly helps us to explain why youthful desires for autonomy had become conflated with demands for political reform in 1774. And so in the final part of my talk, I want to turn to the adult world beyond the political arena in order to think about the wider implications of this generational shift. And I want to start with the Macaroni, because they provide a highly visible example of why understanding age relations is essential if we are to see the events of the 1770s in the same way that contemporaries would have. So the Macaroni was a term first used during the mid-1760s to describe elite young men of fashion like Charles James Fox. But by the mid-1770s, critics were complaining that even apprentices and errand boys were adopting elements of Macaroni fashions. And they were a popular target of satire, but their iconic status was very short-lived, and they were already fading from view by the turn of the 1780s, making this a generational trend that lasted for 12, maybe 15 years at most. Macaronis have proved very difficult to decipher. I mean, they really attract attention, so many historians have looked at them, but they've proved very difficult to decipher. And although they were ridiculed for superficial followers of fashion, examining their characteristics exposes a complex set of traits. Historians have focused on a combination of their effeminacy, elitism, and francophilia, and have debated their sexuality. But surprisingly, age has not been added to this mix. And yet, without this piece of the jigsaw, it's impossible to fully appreciate the cultural trends that the Macaronis represent. In particular, focusing on the issue of gender and sexuality has overshadowed the generational division that the Macaronis embodied. So, for instance, in 1770 of the Macaroni, it says, "There is indeed a kind of animal, neither male nor female, a thing of neuter gender, lately started up amongst us. It's called a Macaroni. It talks without meaning, it smiles without peasantry, it eats without appetite, it rides without exercise, it wenches without passion." To say that this is not a comment on the Macaroni's sexuality could be seen as willful naivety. Peter McNeill, for instance, argues that the Macaroni's homosexuality was explicit. But looking through the lens of age relations sheds a different light on the matter. So, for instance, in 1773, the Westminster magazine claimed that smooth-chinned, hair-brained Macaronis lacked the vigour to experience the joys of womankind. However, given that the beard was noticeably absent from 18th century society, this remark only makes sense if smooth chins were considered to be distinct from shaven faces. And an inability to grow a beard was certainly unmanly, but on the grounds of immaturity, not sexuality. Moreover, early modern medical texts directly linked the growth of facial hair to the production of semen. and so beardless youths were seen to be physically less than a man. In other words, the smooth-chinned macaronis were not real men, but overgrown boys. And the macaroni's outlandish coiffure was the most blatant indication of this immaturity. And yet this has been missed by historians who've sought to explain the cultural connotations of their oversized wigs. And this is because, contrary to general assumption, real macaronis wore dressed hair, not wigs. And they had, along with the rest of their generation, rejected the false hair worn by older men and had instead retained the natural hair of their youth. And this placed them at the centre of a debate in which maturity and its attendant attributes of tradition and experience stood on one side of the social divide and the innate qualities of youth on the other. And it was not just young men. It's important to recognise that there were also female macaronis, and like their male counterparts, these young women were not constrained by the older generation's expectations. And we can see this really clearly in one of my favourite prints, The Modern Woman, which depicts a self-confident young woman sporting a rather masculine hat, who stands whip in hand driving a comically large coach, and she's accompanied by an extremely nervous-looking older male passenger. The text attached "Talk not to me, sir, of your old-fashioned rules, even laughed at by children, the joke of the schools. They might do for your meek-minded matrons of old, who know new use of spirit, but their servants to scold. But for me, zoons and blood, I'm not fit to command. I can swear, sir, and what's more, drive 4 horses in hand." The generational division I'd found was evidently not limited to those who could vote. And looking at the 1770s through the lens of age relations allows us to add an element of meaning to images like this that would have been intuitive to a contemporary eye. And now for my last example, I want to turn to culinary trends. Now clearly fashionable cookery books can't be assumed to directly reflect what was being eaten, but they did embody idealized projections of good taste. I think that's true now. People buy books because they like the look of them, don't necessarily make the meals that are in them. So they embody these idealized projections of good taste that people were buying into. And consequently, they provide revealing insights into the nature of the cultural changes that were taking place. Now, the early 18th century had seen the emergence of fashionable cookbooks written by men who worked in elite kitchens, who ran elite kitchens, and they promoted francophile cosmopolitan cuisine. However, most 18th century cookbooks were written by women, and if we look at the 3 most popular books of the century, this exposes distinct generational perspectives on these elite chefs and their French cuisine. Now, Hannah Glass, whose book we can see here, had grown up just north of Newcastle and published what was probably the best-selling cookbook of the century, The Art of Cooking, in 1747 at the age of 39. Prior to this, the most popular cookbook was written by Eliza Smith, whose Complete Housewife was first appeared in 1727, by which time Smith had been a housekeeper for more than 30 years, and so she must have been in her mid-50s at least, possibly older. In order to counteract what Smith saw as the degenerative foreign influences that were affecting habits in eating, her recipes offered directions for dressing after the best, most natural and most wholesome manner, such provisions as are the product of our country and in a manner that is most agreeable to English palates. Glass took a very different approach in 1747. Unlike Smith, she was not a relic of the 17th century, and she claimed no experience as a housekeeper. And in a highly innovative move, this amateur cook presenting recipes that she claimed were easier and less expensive to make. Her dishes were predominantly European, but hers was the first English cookbook to include a recipe for Indian curry, And in a noteworthy departure from the Francophile fashion she was following, there were some regional English foods, including what appears to be the first printed recipe for Yorkshire pudding. An older cook from Northumberland by the name of Anne Cook accused Glass of having artfully abused the French cooks and as cunningly recommended their cookery for her own. But Glass had not condemned Francophile tastes, only unwarranted extravagance. And by staking a claim to repackaged and supposedly improved cosmopolitan recipes, she offered her readers a home-baked culinary art that was, she claimed, as cultured as French cuisine, but significantly more affordable. This simultaneously challenged the elite's monopoly on taste and an older generation's reactionary Englishness. And I think parallels should be drawn here between the culinary art of Glass and Anne Fisher's vernacular grammar. Both of these women were amateurs in their field, so unrestricted by convention. They were both transgressing gender roles and class boundaries as they redefined civil society on less elite and less patriarchal terms. And both gave English particularities a fashionable quality. A generation later, however, Glass lost her preeminence to a new cookery writer, Elizabeth Raffle, who published The Experienced English Housekeeper in 1769 at the age of 36. Now, Raffle had been starting out in service, so in working life, as Glass published The Art of Cookery in 1747, and she saw no reason to engage in debates that had taken place the generation earlier. Instead, it was Glass's affordable version of cosmopolitan cookery that she challenged, presenting an unashamedly extravagant English cookery that was decidedly imperial in flavour. And her confectionery in particular was as elaborately dressed as the hair of any macaroni. And this was not a re-emergence or a revival of a 17th century relic. Raffle was catering for English tastes, but a book was aimed at a new generation who had no memory of the 1720s, let alone the 17th century. The recipes that she provided certainly were catering to English tastes, but without a hint of the reactionary flavour they had once had. So clearly, the flavour of So, to conclude, I started out by looking for an explanation of the age-based tensions in the political arena in 1774. And what I uncovered was two generational steps in an ongoing and somewhat capricious process of change. By following the children of the 1740s into adult life, I was able to trace the intersection of distinct processes, each with their own chronology and their own trajectory, each playing a part in the interconnected changes that were taking place in the nursery, the schoolroom, the workshop, the kitchen, and the political arena. And all of this was happening as the tensions between tradition and innovation were being played out between the generations. This not only exposed the complex array of factors that resulted in the conflation of youthful assertions of autonomy and demands for political reform in 1774, but also revealed how this was connected to wider cultural shifts in which both indigenous and innate traits were being expressed as part of a more confident and pluralistic national culture that emerged during the second half of the century. And as should be clear by now, mapping the generational contours of society in this way does not provide an orderly picture of cultural change. Instead, it presents a cluttered array of crossing points as various causal factors interweave to produce a rich and vibrant social fabric. But it does expose the manner in which the cultural landscape had been fundamentally redrawn as the mid-century children grew up. And in doing so, I would argue, it demonstrates the value of using age and age relations as a category with which to investigate the past.